Have you ever met someone the whole world had already given up on? A child everyone called broken. A child no family wanted. Now imagine discovering 20 years later that the same little boy would become the only reason you were still alive. If this story touches your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. The first time I saw him, he wasn't crying. That was what frightened me the most. Children usually cried in foster homes. They screamed. They argued. They begged adults not to leave. But the little boy sitting alone beside the rain-streaked window didn't make a sound. He simply stared outside as if he'd already accepted that nobody was coming. His name was Ethan Miller. He was 8 years old, and according to the social worker, he had already been rejected by 14 families. 14. Some said he was too quiet. Others claimed he had behavioral issues. One family returned him after only 6 days because he woke up screaming every night. Another said he never smiled. One cruel couple even wrote in their report, "We couldn't love him." Those words stayed in his file forever. My name is Samuel Brooks. At the time, I was 62. A retired carpenter living in a small town outside Asheville, North Carolina. My wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier after battling cancer. We'd spent 40 years dreaming about children. Doctors said it wasn't possible. So we poured all our love into each other. When she died, the silence inside our little farmhouse became unbearable. Every morning, I'd still make 2 cups of coffee. One for me, one for the woman who would never drink it again. Loneliness becomes a strange companion. It follows you from room to room. It sits across from you at dinner. It reminds you that no one is waiting when you come home. One Sunday after church, Pastor David handed me a flyer. It simply read, "Every child deserves a family." I almost threw it away. After all, who lets a 62-year-old widower adopt a child? The answer I would soon learn: almost nobody. The adoption agency was clean, cheerful, and full of colorful paintings made by children. But behind every drawing was a heartbreaking story. A young counselor greeted me politely. "I'm sorry, sir," she said gently. "Most people your age volunteer. They don't usually apply to adopt." "I know." She hesitated. "Can I ask why now?" I looked at Margaret's wedding ring hanging from a chain around my neck. "Because love doesn't disappear just because the person you shared it with is gone." Her eyes watered. She quietly nodded. For weeks, they interviewed me, inspected my home, reviewed my finances, asked impossible questions. What happens if your health declines? What if the child outlives you? What if he resents having an older father? Every question made sense, but every answer came from the same place. My age doesn't limit how deeply I can love. Nearly 4 months later, the agency finally called. "There is one child." The hesitation in the woman's voice worried me. "He has been waiting a very long time." "What's his name?" "Ethan. Can I meet him?" She paused. "Please don't promise him anything." It was raining the afternoon I walked into the children's common room. Several kids were laughing while building puzzles. Others chased each other with paper airplanes. Only one child sat alone. He didn't even look up when I approached. "Mind if I sit here?" I asked. He shrugged. I noticed he was holding a tiny wooden toy truck. Its paint had almost completely faded. "My dad made it," he whispered. It was the first thing he'd said. "What happened to him?" "He died." "And your mom?" He stared at the floor. "She said she couldn't take care of me anymore." There wasn't anger in his voice, only exhaustion. No child should sound that tired. We sat together for almost an hour, mostly in silence. Then I asked him something no one else apparently had. "What do you like?" He looked confused. "What? What makes you happy?" He frowned as if he'd forgotten happiness even existed. After several seconds, he answered quietly, "I like fixing broken things." I smiled. "So do I." For the first time, he looked directly into my eyes. "You do?" "I'm a carpenter." His expression softened just a little. "My truck is broken. Would you like us to fix it together?" He handed it to me carefully. One wheel had fallen off. Inside my pocket was a small woodworking pencil. Using a paperclip from my notebook, I temporarily repaired the wheel. It wasn't perfect, but it rolled again. Ethan pushed the truck across the table. Back and forth. Back and forth. Then something happened. The tiniest smile appeared. Barely noticeable, but it was there. The social worker standing across the room covered her mouth. Later she told me, I haven't seen him smile in almost 2 years. Over the next several weeks, I visited every Saturday. We built birdhouses, painted old furniture, made toy boats. We rarely talked about the past. We didn't have to. Healing doesn't always begin with words. Sometimes it begins with simply showing up. Again, and again, and again. One afternoon, as I prepared to leave, Ethan suddenly grabbed my sleeve. His voice was almost too quiet to hear. Are you coming back next week? The question broke my heart, because he wasn't asking about next week. He was asking whether I would disappear like everyone else. I knelt beside him. I'll be here. He searched my face carefully. People always say that. I know. Then they leave. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. I'm not people. For the first time, he believed me. Just a little. 3 months later, the judge smiled warmly. Mr. Brooks? At your age, most people are slowing down. You've decided to start over. I nodded. I think life gives us second chances. The judge looked toward Ethan. Young man, do you want Samuel Brooks to become your father? The courtroom became silent. Everyone held their breath. Ethan looked at me, then at the judge. Tears filled his eyes. Finally, he whispered the one word I had waited my entire life to hear. Dad. I couldn't stop crying. Neither could anyone else in the courtroom. I thought I had saved a lonely little boy. I had no idea. He had already begun saving me. But neither of us could have imagined the promise Ethan would make that day, a promise that, 20 years later, he would risk everything to keep, even if it meant facing death himself. The drive home from the courthouse should have felt like a celebration. Instead, it felt strangely quiet. 8-year-old Ethan sat in the passenger seat of my old pickup truck, holding the adoption papers on his lap as though they might disappear if he let go. About halfway home, he finally spoke. Do I have to call you Dad? I glanced over and smiled. You don't have to call me anything you're not comfortable with. He looked out the window. I've never had a dad long enough to remember one. His words hit me harder than I expected. Then we'll take our time, I said. No pressure. For a few miles, we rode in silence again. Then, so softly I almost missed it, he whispered, Okay, Dad. I had to blink away tears before I could see the road again. Our farmhouse wasn't fancy. It creaked when the wind blew. The porch leaned just a little to one side. The paint needed touching up. But it was warm. And for the first time in years, it felt like a home again. Margaret had always dreamed of hearing children's footsteps echo through those halls. As Ethan walked through each room, he stopped in front of a framed photograph of my late wife. Who's she? My wife, I answered. Her name was Margaret. He studied her smiling face. She looks kind. The kindest person I've ever known. He remained quiet for a moment. I wish I could have met her. I smiled sadly. I think she would have loved you. The first few weeks weren't easy. Ethan never complained. But he lived as though he expected everything to be taken away. At dinner, he hid pieces of bread in his pockets. One evening, I noticed him sneaking mashed potatoes into a napkin. Sweetheart, I said gently, why are you saving your food? His shoulders stiffened. In case tomorrow there's none. I realized then that hunger had taught him lessons no child should ever learn. The next morning, I opened every cabinet, every drawer, the refrigerator, the freezer. I invited him into the kitchen. See all this? He nodded. This food belongs to both of us. But what if it runs out? It won't. How do you know? Because as long as I'm breathing, you'll never have to wonder where your next meal comes from. He stared at me for several seconds. Then, without saying a word, he wrapped his small arms around my waist. It was the first hug he'd ever given me. Nights were the hardest. Almost every evening, Ethan woke screaming. Sometimes he cried for his mother. Sometimes for a father he barely remembered. Sometimes he simply shouted, "Don't leave me." I'd rush into his room, sit beside his bed, and wait. I never told him to stop crying. I never told him to be brave. Instead, I'd say the same words every night. I'm here. I know. I'm still here. Eventually, those nightmares became less frequent. Not because the memories disappeared, but because he no longer faced them alone. One Saturday morning, I took Ethan into my woodworking shop. Sunlight poured through the dusty windows. The smell of pine and cedar filled the room. His eyes lit up. So many tools. I laughed. They're dangerous. He nodded seriously. I'll be careful. I handed him a small piece of wood. What are we making? You tell me. He thought for a long moment. A birdhouse. Any reason? He smiled. So birds always know where home is. For a second, I couldn't speak. Children often reveal their deepest wounds without realizing it. Together we measured, sanded, hammered, painted. By sunset, the birdhouse stood proudly on the workbench. It wasn't perfect. Neither were we, but it was ours. School, however, brought new challenges. Children can be kind. They can also be cruel. One afternoon, Ethan climbed into my truck unusually quiet. What happened? Nothing. I knew that tone. After several minutes, he finally admitted, They said you're too old to be my dad. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What did you say? I didn't. He looked at the floor. They laughed because you have gray hair. That evening, I sat beside him on the porch. When I was young, I began. I thought strength came from muscles. What is it really? Keeping your heart kind, even when people aren't kind to you. He considered that. They also said you'll die before I grow up. There it was. The fear he'd been carrying. I took a deep breath. I hope I live a very long time. But nobody knows. That's true. So what if they're right? I looked into his worried eyes. Then I'll spend every day making sure you know how loved you are. His lip trembled. And if you leave? I placed my hand over his. I can't promise how long I'll live. But I promise you'll never doubt that you were loved. Years passed. The frightened little boy slowly disappeared. In his place grew a thoughtful, hard-working young man. He loved fixing broken bicycles for neighborhood kids. He repaired old furniture for elderly neighbors without charging them. Whenever someone thanked him, he'd shrug. My dad taught me that broken things deserve another chance. People assumed he meant chairs. Or tables. They didn't realize he was talking about people. When Ethan turned 16, I gave him a small wooden box. Inside lay the faded toy truck we'd repaired the day we met. I kept it? He asked. I did. He turned it over in his hands, smiling. It still rolls. So do you. He looked confused. What do you mean? You kept moving forward, even when life tried to stop you. His eyes filled with tears. I wouldn't have, without you. Then he reached into his backpack and handed me a folded piece of paper. What is this? A promise. I opened it. Written in careful handwriting were the words, Dad, you've spent your life saving me. One day when you need me most, I'll save you. No matter what it costs, I promise. I chuckled. I hope that day never comes. He smiled. So do I. Neither of us could have imagined how those simple words would one day become the most important promise either of us had ever made. Because just 4 years later, on the morning of Ethan's college graduation, one unexpected phone call would change everything and begin a chain of events that would lead him to risk his own life to save mine. 20 years have a way of slipping through your fingers. One day you're teaching a little boy how to hold a hammer. The next, you're watching a young man straighten his graduation gown. I sat in the front row of the university auditorium, my hands trembling with pride. Ethan, my son, walked across the stage with quiet confidence. He had graduated at the top of his class in emergency medicine. When his name echoed through the room, I stood before anyone else. I clapped until my hands hurt. Some parents cheered because of grades. I cheered because I remembered the little boy who once believed no one would ever choose him. After the ceremony, Ethan spotted me through the crowd. Without caring who was watching, he wrapped me in a hug. You made it, Dad. There wasn't a force on earth that could have kept me away. He laughed. You drove 6 hours. I would have driven 60. For a moment, we simply stood there. 20 years earlier, he had been the child no one wanted. Now people lined up to congratulate him. Life has a beautiful way of proving the world wrong. That evening, we celebrated at a small family restaurant. Halfway through dinner, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you." He handed me a neatly wrapped box. Inside was a beautiful silver wristwatch. On the back was an engraving. "To the man who gave me time, thank you for giving me a lifetime. Love, Ethan." I couldn't speak. My vision blurred with tears. "You didn't have to spend your money on this." He smiled. "I didn't buy you a watch." "What do you mean?" "I bought you more reminders that every minute matters." I fastened it around my wrist. I'll never take it off. I kept that promise. After graduation, Ethan accepted a position as an emergency physician at one of the busiest trauma centers in North Carolina. The hours were brutal. Some nights he worked 18 hours without rest. He saw heartbreak every day. Car accidents, heart attacks, house fires, children, grandparents, people fighting for one more chance. Every Sunday, no matter how tired he was, he came home. We'd sit on the porch with sweet tea. Sometimes we'd talk for hours. Sometimes we'd say almost nothing. Those quiet Sundays became our tradition. One afternoon, I noticed dark circles under his eyes. "You're working too hard," he smiled. "You taught me not to quit. I also taught you to rest." He laughed. "Fair point." Then his face grew serious. "Dad." "Yeah?" "I still keep that promise." "What promise?" "The one I wrote when I was 16. I chuckled. "I remember. I meant every word." I squeezed his shoulder. "I know." At the time, neither of us realized how soon that promise would be tested. A few months later, autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. I decided to spend the afternoon repairing the old roof on our barn. Ethan had warned me, "Wait until I'm off work. I can handle one little repair." He frowned. "You've earned the right to let me help." I smiled. "And you've earned the right to stop worrying." He shook his head. "I learned worrying from you." We both laughed. It was the last carefree conversation we would have for a long time. The next morning began like any other. I climbed onto the roof before sunrise. The air was cool. Birds sang from the trees. I replaced a few loose boards. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then I stepped backward, onto a rotten plank I hadn't noticed. It snapped. The world disappeared beneath my feet. I remember the sound of splintering wood, the rush of air. Then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, I couldn't move. Pain exploded through my chest. My left leg twisted beneath me. Breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers. The screen was cracked from the fall. Barely able to see, I managed to dial 911. Then everything faded. At the hospital, alarms echoed through the emergency department. Doctors rushed around my bed. Nurses called out blood pressure numbers. Someone shouted, "Internal bleeding?" Another voice answered, "Prepare the operating room." Then a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "No. No, no. Dad!" Even through the haze, I recognized it. Ethan. His face had gone pale. For one terrifying second, he wasn't a doctor. He was just my son. Another physician gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can't lead this surgery." "I know." "Your family." Ethan closed his eyes, struggling to regain control. Then he nodded. "Save him. I don't care what it takes. Just save my dad." The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. Broken ribs, a collapsed lung, severe internal injuries, massive blood loss. The waiting room felt endless. Ethan refused to go home. He sat outside the operating room, still wearing blood-stained scrubs from another patient's surgery. Every nurse who passed offered quiet words of comfort. Many of them knew our story. They knew I was the man who had adopted the quiet little boy everyone else had overlooked. Now that little boy had grown into the doctor praying for one more chance to keep his father alive. Late that night, the surgeon finally stepped into the hallway. The operation was successful. Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. "But," the doctor's expression changed, "your father lost a tremendous amount of blood. There may be complications." We won't know for several days. Ethan thanked him. Then he walked into my hospital room. Machines beeped softly around me. I looked small beneath the blankets. Gray, fragile, older than he had ever seen me. He gently took my hand. For years, I had held his hand through nightmares. Now it was his turn to hold mine. With tears streaming down his face, he whispered, "You kept every promise you ever made to me. Now it's my turn, Dad. I promised I'd save your life. And I don't break promises." But Ethan had no idea that the greatest danger wasn't over. Because within 48 hours, my condition would suddenly worsen, and only one impossible decision could keep me alive. For 2 days, everyone believed I was getting better. The bleeding had stopped. My breathing was steadier. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. Ethan finally allowed himself to smile. He even went home for a few hours to shower and change clothes, promising the nurses he'd be back before sunrise. But life has a way of changing in a single phone call. At 3:17 a.m., Ethan's phone rang. The moment he answered, his face lost all color. "Dr. Miller," the nurse said urgently, "your father's condition is crashing. You need to come now." He didn't even change out of his jacket. He ran, ignoring every red light he safely could. His heart pounded louder than the sirens in the distance. When he reached the ICU, doctors surrounded my bed. One of them turned to Ethan. "We found the problem." "What is it?" "A hidden injury damaged his liver more than we realized. He's bleeding internally again." "Can you operate?" "We can, but even if the surgery succeeds, he may not survive without an immediate blood donation." "What blood type?" The doctor answered. "O negative." Ethan froze. "So am I." The doctor looked at him carefully. "You've already donated recently." "I know. If you donate again this soon, you could put your own health at risk." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Take my blood." "You don't understand." "I do." "It isn't recommended." "I don't care." "Dr. Miller, you could collapse." He looked through the glass window at me. 20 years of memories rushed through his mind. The birdhouse, the toy truck, the bedtime stories, the first baseball game, the college graduation, the engraved watch, the words, "You'll never wonder where your next meal comes from." Then he quietly repeated the promise he had written at 16. "One day when you need me most, I'll save you." He turned back to the doctors. "I'm not just his physician. I'm his son, and today, I'm keeping my promise." The donation went ahead. The medical team monitored Ethan closely while preparing me for emergency surgery. He grew pale, weak, but he never complained. As the nurses wheeled my bed toward the operating room, Ethan managed to squeeze my hand. Though I was barely conscious, I whispered something almost no one could hear. "My son?" Those 2 words were enough. Tears rolled down Ethan's face. "I love you too, Dad." The surgery lasted through the morning. Friends from church gathered in the waiting room. Neighbors arrived with homemade casseroles no one was hungry enough to eat. Former foster parents, social workers, and even the judge who had finalized our adoption years ago came to the hospital after hearing the news. The elderly social worker who had first introduced us looked at Ethan with tears in her eyes. "I remember when people said no one would ever want you." Ethan smiled softly. "One man did." She shook her head. "No, he didn't just want you. He believed in you, and today you've honored that belief." Late that afternoon, the surgeon finally stepped out. Everyone stood. The hallway fell silent. The doctor smiled. "He's going to make it." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then relief swept through the room. People cried, laughed, prayed. Ethan leaned against the wall, emotionally exhausted. For the first time in nearly 3 days, he allowed himself to breathe. My recovery was slow. Very slow. Weeks passed before I could walk without assistance. Months before I regained my strength. Ethan visited every day, even after working long shifts. Sometimes he'd read the newspaper aloud. Sometimes we'd play cards. Sometimes we'd simply sit together in comfortable silence. One afternoon, I noticed he looked unusually tired. "You gave blood for me, didn't you?" He tried to smile. "It wasn't a big deal." "It was." He looked down. "I made a promise. You remember?" "I've remembered every day." I reached into the bedside drawer. Inside was the folded note he had written at 16. The edges were worn from years of being opened and read. I handed it to him. I kept this all these years. He unfolded it slowly. His handwriting looked so young, so hopeful. He laughed through his tears. I can't believe you saved it. I saved it because I knew the kind of man you'd become. 6 months later, our little town held its annual community festival. Without telling me, the mayor arranged a special ceremony. People packed the town square. The local newspaper was there. So were families Ethan had treated over the years. The mayor stepped onto the stage. Today we're honoring not one hero, but two. He invited us both forward. Then he said something I'll never forget. 20 years ago, Samuel Brooks adopted a little boy no one else wanted. That act of love didn't just change one child's future. It changed this entire community. Because that little boy grew up to save hundreds of lives. And one of them was the man who first saved his. The crowd rose to its feet. The applause seemed to last forever. Ethan looked at me and whispered, "You saved me first." I smiled. "No, son. We saved each other." That evening, we drove home as the sun dipped below the mountains. The old farmhouse looked exactly as it had 20 years earlier. The birdhouse we built together still hung from the oak tree. Weathered, faded, but standing strong. Just like us. As we sat on the porch, Ethan glanced at the silver watch he'd given me years before. "It still works." I smiled. "So does this old heart." He laughed. "You know, Dad." "What?" "You once told me that broken things deserve another chance." "I remember." He looked out across the fields. "I finally realized you weren't talking about furniture." "No, I was talking about people." He nodded. "And because one man believed that, I got a family." I placed my arm around his shoulder. "And because one little boy trusted an old widower, I got a son." Sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the strongest or the richest. They're simply the people who choose to love someone everyone else has forgotten. One act of kindness can echo across decades, changing not just one life, but generations. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment telling us what act of kindness changed your life. Your story might inspire someone who needs hope today.